Uh, we're going to be hearing from Stephanie Stronsick, who's the founder and executive director of Pennsylvania Bat Rescue. Steph got her start with bats at Project Wildlife in San Diego, where she helped initiate rescuing bats as part of their protocol. Later, she volunteered at the San Diego Natural History Museum, working on the San Diego Mammals Atlas, preservation of bat specimens, and as a field assistant. And then, after relocating to her home state of PA, she worked as an associate field biologist for bat conservation and management. And in 2012, she established Pennsylvania Bat Rescue. So tonight she's going to tell us some more about the natural history of bats and explain why bats are vital to the health of our ecosystems, and tell us how we can protect our backyard bats. And we'll also get to meet some of the Pennsylvania Bat Rescue education bats, which will be very, very interesting. So without further ado, Steph, I'd like to turn the virtual platform over to you and welcome you, and thank you very much for giving us this program tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be participating in this. And I do apologize if there is any delays with the internet on my side. Unfortunately, we do live in a pretty country style setting, so internet is very sparse here. But yes, my name is Stephanie Stronsick, and I am the founder of Pennsylvania Bat Rescue. I have been rehabilitating bats. This is my 15th year, going on my 16th year. I can't believe it. Very exciting. And so I started bats in San Diego, and now I'm here. And there's a lot of different things going on with our bats in Pennsylvania and throughout the world. And bats are really a misunderstood animal. So I'm going to just hop right in and discuss why bats are so important. So let me, there we go. So our mission is conservation, education, and rehabilitation. Our rescue center is dedicated to the rescue and the rehabilitation of our native bat species. And this is really through conservation efforts, not just within the rehab setting, but also in the natural environment. So our mission kind of encompasses not just the rehabilitation aspect and of course education, but we also do real life field research and conservation. I am permitted to take bats and work with bats to the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I also hold several federal permits as well, and we work with federally and state endangered bat species here. So we work a lot with our biologists, our local biologists, and biologists throughout the country and Canada as well. Introduction to bats. Bats are the only flying mammal. So other animals like flying squirrels and things like that, they don't actually fly, they glide. Bats are the only true flying mammals, and they kind of are really interesting in the fact that they have an exceptionally long life. Some bat species, especially the smaller ones, can live 20 to 30 years. The smallest bat, one of the smaller bats, actually had a life expectancy of 42 years, which was banded in the 70s and recaptured 42 years later. Bats being small and a flying mammal, they are actually one of the slowest reproducing mammals for their size. Many bat species only give birth to one baby bat a year. They don't have litters of bats or pups, as we call them. They are babies, but they only give birth to one. For the most part, there are exceptions, but most of the bat species throughout the world only give birth to one. And bats are really interesting because they fulfill a specialized niche. Every bat consumes different food, whether it's nectar, whether it's fruit, whether it's insects. So every bat species is very different. And our bats here in Pennsylvania don't eat just any insects. They are very specialized in what species of insect they choose to consume. Many are consumers of moth species. Many are also consumers of beetle and leafhopper species. So it really depends on the species of bat and their nutritional requirements. Bats have been around for a really, really long time, 52-ish million years. And so they have been around for a very long time, including some major catastrophic events throughout the world. And without very little evolutionary adaptation from their fossilized skeleton here from 52.5 million years ago, the structure of the bones is very similar to the structure of a bat skeleton you would see today for an insect eating species. What you do see on some of the finger bones is little claws, though, so that's a little bit different. But for the most part, they have survived for millions of years without very little evolutionary adaptation necessary. So they're great at surviving. And one of those reasons is because many of the bat species are smaller. So there are two types of bats throughout the world: the megabats, or the New World bats, and the microbats, the Old World bats. And the megabats are mostly fruit-eating bats, or bats that you would see closer to the equator. So they live in tropical, subtropical regions. They also do have microbats in Australia as well, and throughout those regions. But generally, you will never see a fruit bat in Pennsylvania or in the regions where it's cooler and more arid. So we do not have any fruit bats here in Pennsylvania. We have the tiny guys, the microbats, and our bats in Pennsylvania and throughout most of the United States eat only insects. Bats are not rodents, and they are very interesting in the fact that they form their own order called Chiroptera. So what I have here is the human hand, and you can see our finger bones and our thumb, and the bat wing anatomy is very similar. They have the same bones and tendons as we do, with the exception of some of their joints can bend in different ways that ours cannot. And so that gives them the flight capability, but otherwise their bones are elongated fingers. And then you can see the depiction of a bird. They do not have a similar skeletal structure closest to a human or even a bat. So birds have a very kind of straight linear flight pattern, whereas bats, you will notice in the summer months, they can be all over the place and change the trajectory of their flight pattern in a second. And so Chiroptera translates to hand wing because their wing is their hand. They do have a thumb. A lot of our foliage roosting bats use their thumb to climb up trees to hang on to things. And on occasion, they will use their thumbs to put food closer towards their mouth. So once they grab a flying insect, sometimes they'll move it around with their thumbs, even sometimes in flight. This is a really small depiction of just how many bat species are throughout the world. It's around 1,440 species as of, I believe, today. 4 more species have been identified in the sub-Saharan Africa region, which was really amazing to read. But this is a kind of a smaller depiction, and we're going to see that around 720, now of course these numbers have changed since I made this, 720-ish are insects or bug-eating bats. These bats eat only insects and get all their nutritional requirements from the insects. Of course, they will eat mosquitoes, but that is not their primary diet. Mosquitoes have very little nutritional value. It's almost like an easy appetizer for them. So mosquitoes are great because they don't really do anything. They just kind of hover in the air. And juvenile bats find them very easy to hunt. So it's great practice for the juvenile bats. But most of the bat species will eat moths and different types of beetle, including agricultural pests. Here in Pennsylvania, our big brown bats eat a lot of the agricultural pests that farmers and orchards spray insecticide to rid themselves of. So our bats are doing a big service to our agricultural lands in Pennsylvania and throughout the world. There are around 240 fruit-eating bats. These bats are responsible for 99% of the rainforest. They are exceptionally messy eaters. They try to acquire a lot of the juices out of the fruit. So they're eating overripe fruit. They're not eating fruit that would be considered something that humans could consume. So a lot of the bats in Australia and throughout the closer regions to the equator are having issues because farmers are netting their orchards, keeping the bats from getting to their food supply. But a lot of the fruit bats, if you just allow the fruit to ripe, would feed on that instead and not inhibit the product that they're trying to raise. But the fruit-eating bats are responsible for pollinating, indirectly pollinating the rainforest by seed dispersal. And that's because when they suck the juices out of the fruit, they actually spit all the pulp, and sometimes the seeds will be, they'll spit them out or they'll excrete them through their guano, and they indirectly pollinate through seed dispersal. I should say they seed disperse the fruit in the tropical rainforest. Messy eaters helping our rainforests grow. There are around 50 nectar feeding bats. These bats are really interesting that they only feed on nectar at night. Of course, they are nocturnal. And these flowers and these plants build a coexisting relationship over many, 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 many years, where bats are considered one of the primary pollinators of certain species of plant. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So these nectar plants, these usually desert growing plants, are only pollinated by bats. So there's a very specific coexisting relationship there. Around 7 bats are meat-eating bats. And what that means is they will eat small snakes and small lizards and things like that. Nothing large. They're not a large bat. 5 are fish-eating bats. These bats are equipped with some interesting sonar capabilities. Most bats, especially our insect-eating bats, they echolocate, which we will get into in a little bit, but their echolocation cannot penetrate water, so they don't see water as something that they could potentially crash into. So bats can swim for the most part, but fish-eating bats can actually, their echolocation can penetrate the surface of the water, where a lot of the small minnows and small fish like to come up for air or even hunt some insects on the surface of the water. And these bats are equipped with really giant feet comparative to their other cousins, and they can skim the surface of the water and catch those minnows very easily. And out of 1,440 species, 3 are vampire bats. And these bats are really interesting because they only take about a tablespoon of blood from their preferred food source, which is usually cow or chicken. These bats do not occur in the United States or Canada. We do not have any vampire bats here. They are in Latin America and South American regions. And one of the most interesting qualities of these bats is not only are they communal, but they will also help raise each other's babies if something happened to mom, or if mom doesn't come back in time to feed her young. Another interesting thing about vampire bats is if you know somebody who has heart issues, vampire bats have an anesthetic property in their saliva, and they also have an anticoagulant property. It's a protein in their saliva that keeps the blood from clotting. And so chemists and scientists have worked together to synthesize the protein and make heart medications, anticoagulant heart medications for heart using the similar protein structure of the vampire bat saliva. These are some of the bats that we have in Pennsylvania. So on the left is not necessarily a native species, but it's certainly becoming more increasingly coming into care a little bit more recently. And it's a Seminole bat, and Seminole bats live further south. They don't typically inhabit Pennsylvania. We're not really sure why. This was actually a pup that came into care. She's pretty much full grown in this photo, but we're not sure why the females are giving birth up this far north, but it's definitely interesting. So they're not considered native. And on the right is a eastern red bat. It's actually male, so he's brightly colored. You can kind of see the difference in coloration of the two. Although they look similar, we have to look at the size of the bat in order to determine the species sometimes. Fur coloration and this part of their ear, they have a tragus that's really pronounced, and we have to actually look at the tragus to determine species as well. So it's not always very easy to determine species. On the left, we have a silver-haired bat. This is actually one of our bats that you're going to see tonight. His name is Gizmo. And he blends in very well with the tree in the background. That's part of their camouflage. This particular species will inhabit tree hollows, loose bark, especially on the shagbark hickory, and they will definitely roost in abandoned woodpecker holes. And occasionally, for whatever reason, they will go into bat houses. Maybe it's for shelter reasons if there's a storm or something, but we have gotten silverhair bats out of bat houses before. And on the right is a hoary bat. This is the largest bat in Pennsylvania, and they are a really interesting species. They they roost up to 40 to 60 feet in pine trees. White pine is preferred by them, but any coniferous plant, tree species, they will roost really high up in. And their coloration helps them to camouflage, looking like a pine cone. This species does fly at high altitudes. They can fly up to 10,000 feet. They have a really beautiful furred tail. They have really thick fur, so they can tolerate really cold temperatures. They are solitary. Both the silverhair and the hoary bat are solitary, as well as the Seminole and the red bat. And here's some of our crevice bats. These ladies were pups of ours a few years ago that grew up beautifully. This little coloration on their wings is actually a temporary ID band, just to ensure that we're making all the best judgments based on their needs. So we do keep identification bands on them. They do get removed prior to release. Crevice bats are a little bit more social. And if you have a barn or an attic, or you know somebody who had a colony of bats or has a colony of bats, they're incredibly social. They have a lot of different vocalizations, meaning different things. And they are incredibly social with each other and with newcomers. So bat colonies change throughout time. And so individuals that were in a colony one year might move on and migrate to a different colony the next year. And they're quite accepting of each other and sometimes of other species. So how do bats see at night? Well, that's a good question. A lot of people think bats are blind. Bats are not blind. Our fruit bats actually can see in color because they are hunting fruit. I don't want to really say hunting because they don't hunt, but they forage for fruit. And they use their great sense of smell and their big, beautiful, bright eyes to see in color. They can see fruit. Our little guys here in the United States, in Pennsylvania, they see in black and white and a gray scale. So their eyes aren't necessarily adapted for seeing insects. However, they have a built-in system that they are amazing with. It's an evolutionary adaptation, and it's called echolocation, and they can see with high frequency sound. Most people cannot hear a bat echolocating. If we could, it would sound like a jet taking off. They are very loud, and their echolocation is very loud. So if you've ever used a bat detector, it picks up their echolocation and transmits it into something that we can visually see and identify with each species, because each species has a different call. And they also have different calls based on if they are around, if they're being territorial or if there's a mate nearby. They also have different calls for when they're pups for the females. They have different vocalizations for them. And then the echolocation is also a little bit different when they're hunting. So this high frequency sound bounces off of everything, giving them a real-time perspective of their environment. So if you happen to notice, and we'll go through some images, the fruit bats have really big eyes and really small ears, whereas the insect-eating bats are the opposite. They have really small eyes and really big ears. Fruit bats their food doesn't fly in the air, so they don't need to have echolocation. So they don't need giant ears, whereas our echolocating bats have these big satellite dishes on their head, picking up sound and helping them hunt and determine what they're hunting and where they're hunting. And it's really an interesting adaptation that they have. So if you could see, this is another depiction of if a bat, you can see how well a bat hears as opposed to a dog or a human. Sometimes young children or young adults can actually hear certain species of bat echolocating, usually the larger species. But thankfully, if we can't hear them echolocating, because it would be a lot of noise, especially if you have a colony in your house, it would be a lot of noise. If you happen to visit Texas, this is one of the largest urban colonies of bats in the world. The Congress Avenue Bridge bridge based in Austin, Texas. It has approximately 1.5 million bats. There's several bridges and Bracken Cave nearby, in which a large concentration of maternity colonies inhabit. And in the summer, there's so many bats that it takes several hours for the females to fly out and start foraging. So they actually fly out kind of early. As you can see, it's quite daylight here in this photo. And so this is the largest concentration of bats in an urban setting in the world. Rehabilitation is a really interesting thing that we do. It's very rewarding, and we love educating people about what we do and why rehabilitation actually is important. Wildlife rehabilitation is a professional atmosphere where we treat and care for injured, orphaned, sick, and distressed bats. And our ultimate goal is to release them back into the wild where they belong. Bats are incredibly important, and we want them to fulfill their ecological niche. So what it is that we do, well, bats being one of the flying animals in the world and the only flying mammal in the world, they will occasionally collide with things, whether it be a car, whether it be it's mostly cars. Sometimes they will collide with buildings or other moving objects, but typically they collide with cars or they fall out of their roosting spot. This is, if you follow us on social media, this is the Countess when she arrived. She had a fractured humerus, which is the same type of bone. It's right near the shoulder on humans. She likely fell out of her tree. She was a young juvenile learning to fly, and we had some pretty serious storms in late summer, and she probably fell out of the tree and fractured her wing. We rely on our veterinarians to help us with situations like this, where they pinned the bone. So basically they stuck a catheter needle in her bone, which sounds and is very painful, but it healed really well. And unfortunately though, she's one of our education bats because during the healing process, she was getting a little see and not happy with her little taped arm. So we had to untape her, and she rotated her arm, making the bone a little more challenging to heal in a position that gave her flight capability. So she's not able to fly, but enjoys mealworms hand fed to her every single night. MIXON was one of our bats that we rescued a long time ago, but it's still a great story. If you're somewhat local, this is a bat that came from MIXON State Park. They were cleaning out the bat houses, and she was behind it, and they didn't know that she was behind it. They were cleaning it out and fall, and she fell to the ground. And I thought for sure she would have fractured her wing because that was a pretty big fall on a really hard, solid ground. But I didn't notice any fractured wings, but instead you can see that her canine teeth, which they use for crunching those hard exoskeletons of beetles, they're not there to scare us. Her teeth are not aligned properly. So bats' teeth are positioned in such a way that they're compact in their mouth and they line up perfectly. Unfortunately, her teeth were not lined up, and that was because she had a dislocated jaw. And that was really challenging because we had never attempted, first of all, we never had a situation like this. This was a first, and our veterinarian had never attempted a procedure to realign the jaw and make it so that she could eat and echolocate again. So he performed a tiny surgical procedure on her and realigned her jaw and sutured it in place. Within a few weeks, she recovered, and she not only flew well, but she was echolocating and she was released back at her home, and she immediately started hunting, which is always the best thing, especially when we release bats that had a challenging time, and they get released and they just fly around and you can see them hunting immediately. It's wonderful. We do get a lot of glue trap bats. And unfortunately, this is something that we continue to deal with. A lot of glue traps are used by pest control companies or residents wanting to capture insects or mice. But when we set these out, people don't realize that when insects get trapped, they still make noise. Even though we can't hear it, they may make noise with their wings or their feet. And this is perfect for young bats or bats that are starving. They can hear these noises and it's easy food, so they go to grab it and they get stuck to the glue trap. What's really important, and this image is very distressing, but what is really important is not to remove the bats or any animal from the glue trap, because you could seriously injure them. It's as hard as it is, and as much as we want to save them immediately from the pain that they're enduring, please let it up to a rehabilitator, because removing bats from a glue trap, you can break so many of their tiny finger bones. And we don't release the bats right away. We have to stabilize them for weeks on end and make sure they don't have any injuries that weren't obvious when we first took them off. So it takes a long time to get these bats back out into the wild. And the same thing goes with birds and other animals in this situation. It takes time, and a rehabilitator is absolutely necessary when dealing with situations like this. If you live in Pennsylvania, or New Jersey, we have an issue with the spotted lanternfly, and these are giant glue bands. Now, the difference between the glue trap that you saw previously and the glue band is that the glue bands are actually made out of a different material than the glue traps. The glue traps don't tend to be as sticky, whereas these giant glue bands, the adhesive is not only really sticky, but tends to be really toxic to bats. I'm not entirely sure about birds. I do know that there can be a high mortality with stress with birds that are stuck to glue bands, but for bats, they try so desperately to get off the glue bands that they sometimes chew their own arms off. And it's a really unfortunate situation that we have to talk about, because it's becoming more and more prevalent in regions that are experiencing spotted lanternfly. These are not acceptable. These are not humane, and our wildlife is unfortunately suffering devastating effects from these. So we encourage people to, instead of using glue bands, if you have to, put chicken wire, or even better, hardware cloth with really small holes so that the bats and other small animals can't get in there and get stuck. Or you could, one of the things that we do at the rehab center, which is in Berks County, which apparently was the epicenter of the spotted lanternfly issue, we started squishing the not only the spotted lanternflies themselves, but removing the egg casings on the trees. And that's really what we have done. And we have noticed a reduction in the spotted lanternfly in Berks County. It's probably likely because this particular insect swarms, so they don't really always stay in the same place year after year. But we are encouraging people. I know the spotted lanternfly is really a pain. Nobody enjoys it, but please don't use these giant glue bands. We do get bats that are cat caught, bats and pets, but they're also really great hunters. And so it's really important to keep cats indoors, not only for the safety of wildlife, but also the safety of themselves, for themselves. They don't know what a car is, and there's a lot of environmental issues that they can experience, such as parasitism and other diseases like FIV or feline AIDS is really a big thing out in feral cat communities. So it's really important, as well as rabies, to keep cats indoors. This was a situation where an eastern red bat, this is a female, she came into care after being attacked by a cat. And when she came into care, she was really kind of chubby, and I knew that she was pregnant. So we had to perform an emergency surgery with obviously the help of our veterinarian. And she wasn't anesthetized. She had to be heavily sedated, but not anesthetized. So her unborn pups would not be injured. And we removed the fractured bones that were impaired by the attack. And a few days later, she gave birth to 3 babies that we helped her raise, and they were released. But unfortunately, mom succumbed to infection several weeks later after her pups were released and did not make it. So although she is no longer with us, her babies were released. But this is a great situation to discuss why cats are better indoors. Again, bats fly, so they will collide with things, and especially if they're young, and they're learning how to drive, they're definitely going to have issues. So we do try our best to repair fractured bones. The best thing you can do if you find a bat in need, doesn't matter what the issue is, always contact a wildlife rehabilitator. Time is of the essence, especially with these tiny animals and the multitude of injuries that they succumb to. So it's really important to get them to a rehabilitator so they can treat them immediately with the best possible outcome. When I was living in California, we got a lot of nuisance calls, as we would call them. We don't really get them so much here in Pennsylvania. Generally speaking, most of the bats that are found are in need of help to some degree. But this was California, and this tiny little brown speck in the top left corner of the condo was just hanging out, sleeping, and the homeowner was terrified because they couldn't get to their washer and dryer from their condo, which is the door that's open, because that tiny little brown speck was roosting there. So we did safely contain him and release him that night, and hopefully he didn't return to scare the homeowners. We get a lot of orphan bats, especially in Pennsylvania. It gets hot here. And we also have a lot of big brown bats, and they give birth to one baby a year. But when it gets really hot and mother's really stressed, especially if there's not enough insects to eat, occasionally they will fall for mom, or they will accidentally fall. And we will get a phone call, and we will be taking care of this baby for 10 weeks and getting up every 2 hours around the clock to feed them. Baby bats are intense. Mom and baby are not separated for quite some time after they're born. So when the baby bats are born, they are born with their eyes closed, and they're totally dependent on mom. And so they hang on to mom for the first week of life. So as she's going out foraging for insects, flying very fast through the night sky, she has this tiny little baby clinging to her, trying to stay warm and trying to hang on and nurse at the same time. As time goes on, the baby bat becomes a little bit bigger and harder to carry. Mom will leave the baby back at the nursery colony. And so babies are not left by themselves totally. The moms take shifts, and they go out and they hunt close by, and then they'll come back and they'll feed, and then they'll go back out. And it takes several weeks for the pups to grow up, about 8 to 10 weeks for a big brown, and they become a juvenile and start learning to fly and forage for themselves. And so this is not a native bat, but it is super cute. You can see those giant ears. Baby bats are born with full-grown thumbs and full-grown feet, and that is to grasp onto mom. So that is like a mother giving birth to a human with size 10 feet. And also baby bats weigh a third of mom's weight. So that's a pretty big baby for a tiny animal. And this is just a comparison photo. These are baby fruit bats. So you can see previous photo was an insect-eating bat, and then this is a fruit bat. And look at those giant feet and those giant thumbs. Sometimes we get bats where people try to raise them. It's really not a good idea, because bats have a specialized milk formula. They grow exceptionally fast with a high calcium nutrient requirement and protein. Very important that they have those nutritional requirements. They are a mammal, so they do drink milk, but their milk is very specialized. This person knew that this big brown was a mammal and that he needed to have milk when he was a baby. So she started giving him cow milk. And as you can probably understand, cows grow a lot slower than bats. And so he developed what's called metabolic bone disease, and he became an education bat many years ago. And it is very painful. You can see the distortion of the finger bones. So if you do find a baby bat, you might be asked to try to reunite the baby, which is the best possible thing for the baby. Mother always does a better job than we do. So if you can't reunite and it's absolutely impossible, then you can contact a local wildlife rehabilitator and try to get the baby to them as soon as possible. And with 1,400 species of bats, they're going to have some very interesting characterizations. This is a horseshoe-nosed bat named after his horseshoe-shaped nose. And look at those giant satellite ears. So this is an insect species, insect-eating species, and they emit an echolocation actually out of their nose that bounces back into those giant satellite ears and helps them forage throughout their habitat. And this is a bulldog bat, given its name for the fact that he looks like a bulldog. I kind of think he looks like a Great Dane, but regardless, it has very canine-like features. A lot of the bats sometimes do, and this is another 2 different species of horseshoe nose bats, and you can see the different characterizations of their nose. No bat species is like each other. They're all very different. And these are wrinkle-faced ghost bats. They're adorable. It's theorized that those cartilage channels are actually to help echolocation get diverted back into their ears. So evolutionary adaptation is very interesting. And this is a species of bat that this is a male, and they have this funny hairdo to attract the ladies. So that little hairstyle is simply for trying to attract the female bats. And so when he doesn't have that up, they just fly with it down. It's very cute. These are Egyptian fruit bats. And this is as big as they get. They don't get much bigger. Not all fruit bats are giant flying foxes. Some of them are smaller, and they do eat a lot of fruit. These guys are quite small. And this is just a fun little picture to show you just how silly fruit bats are. They try to eat the whole thing, and they squeeze the juice out and spit out the pulp and the seeds. This is a nectar feeding bat. This is one of the, I think this is a Mexican long tongue bat. And at the bottom left portion of the photo, you can see the nectar at the bottom of the flower. They have a tongue that's 2/3 their body length and stretches all the way down there to acquire the nectar. And you can see in the meantime, they're getting pollinated with all the pollen. They're getting covered in pollen. And this is a photo taken of a resident in Arizona. They had a hummingbird feeder outside and could not understand why the nectar was going down every night. And so they set up a camera and found that it was actually nectar feeding bats helping themselves to the hummingbird feeder. Here's another image. And this is a co-evolutionary relationship with this woolly bat and one of the, I think this is a Thai, possibly. I think it's a pitcher plant in the Thailand region. The soil is not very high in nitrogen. So it's very interesting. This carnivorous pitcher plant actually provides a safe sleeping place for this woolly bat. And in return, the bat gets a safe place to snooze, and the pitcher plant gets nitrogen from the bat guano, because bats typically go to the bathroom right before they take flight. So they have this very important relationship with each other. And you can see this pitcher plant has a reflective, the angle in which the top part of the pitcher plant, the cap, is angled, it's actually like a landing strip for this species of bat. And so he can figure out where to go based on the angle of this cap. And this is one of, this is a tent making bat, a Honduran tent making bat, and they are about the size of a cotton ball. And this is one of the only bat species that chews or modifies its environment for its needs. So these bats are roosting in a banana leaf, and that banana leaf will hang down once they chew it, so it gives them shelter. But our bats here in Pennsylvania, they don't chew any part of their environment. Their teeth are so small they would break if they did. Chew wood, they don't chew insulation or wires. Here's another bat species in the subtropics. It actually has a neat adaptation. It has little suction cups on its thumbs and on its feet, so it doesn't slip down any of the leaves that are covered in condensation from all the humidity. The agave is pollinated by a bat, and it's really, really amazing. The agave relies on this bat for pollination, and the bat relies on the agave for food source as they migrate. And that was one of our products that we had a while ago. This is a picture of what our shelves would look like without bats, specifically pollinating bats. So our shelves would be really bare. Bats pollinate and seed disperse a lot of different fruits, as you can see. White nose syndrome is really important here in Pennsylvania. It's one of the reasons most of our bats are in severe decline. White nose syndrome affects big browns, little browns, tricoloreds, Indiana bats, small-footed, myotis, silverhair, and northern long-eared bat. So a lot of our bats. In Pennsylvania, we have 11 of bats, and out of those 11 species, technically we have 11. 9 of them are native to Pennsylvania, and out of those 9, 5 are considered either state endangered, state threatened, or federally threatened due to white nose syndrome. 6 million bats have died since the discovery of white nose syndrome in a single cave in upstate New York in 2006, and it got its name from the white fungus that grows on the muzzle and ears, any of the exposed skin of the bats. And this is the time of the year that we should be observant of the bats. This is the time of the year where they are heavily infected with white nose syndrome. Not all bats have white nose syndrome, but if you do find a bat out during the day or roosting in a weird location, it doesn't necessarily mean it has rabies. It could be suffering from white nose syndrome. And in Pennsylvania, we have the most caves and mines of any state in the Northeast, and it is a race to save our bats. A lot of bats hibernate here for the winter, and a lot of them are being decimated by white nose syndrome. And this is what white nose syndrome does to the wing. It is a fungus, so it does eat the living tissue of the bats, creates large holes, and it presents a lot of issues. Bats do hibernate here, so they are in a very deep sleep. This fungus kind of makes them feel like they have sunburn where it itches and it hurts at the same time. They wake 3 times as much when they have white nose syndrome as opposed to if they don't in the winter. So it depletes them of their fat reserves essential for surviving the winter months. And so they'll come out prematurely from the caves and mines, and they might be licking snow, they might be trying to find water, and they're basically starving and dehydrating to death and sometimes freezing. At Pennsylvania Bat Rescue, we formulated a treatment a few years ago. This is kind of an illustration. I know it kind of got cut off, but we had several bats that had white nose syndrome. These were little brown bats, and our treatment is amazing for bats in captivity. It cannot be used out in the wild because it is an antimicrobial, so it will kill a lot of different essential bacteria and fungi. There are beneficial bacteria and beneficial fungi. So we don't use that out in the wild, but we do treat them here in captivity. And this is the current occurrence map. As you can see, it's very colorful. That is not a good thing. This is where white nose syndrome has either been detected or on bats, or bats have died from white nose syndrome. And if you're interested in learning more about white nose syndrome, you can visit the white nose syndrome response team, or you can just type in white nose syndrome, and there's a wonderful website that gives a lot of great information. Some of the things that we're doing to help our bats is restricting cave activity during certain times of the year so that people don't accidentally contaminate a new site that hasn't been contaminated, and also allowing our bats to naturally hibernate without interference. Bats and rabies is really important. The one thing, if we could say, to take away from this is don't handle a bat barehanded and you have no exposure risk. So if you wear thick gloves and a towel and get the bat into a secure container with a secure lid, you're good to go. As long as you don't handle them barehanded, everything is fine. And anybody who works with bats has to be rabies vaccinated. Raccoons have the highest incidence of rabies in Pennsylvania. They are super cuddly and cute, but they are a wild animal and they are a rabies vector species. So please don't handle them barehanded. One of the things you can do, or several things that you can do for our bats, is building bat houses. There are several websites such as Bat Conservation and Management and Bat B&B. They have some amazing bat houses. Humane exclusion and relocation can only be done in the spring or in the fall in Pennsylvania. It cannot be done in the winter because bats are hibernating and you can't kick them out into the wild when it's very cold outside. And during the summer, humane exclusion is not legal because females only give birth to one baby. And so acceptable in the summer, and learning to just coexist with bats is really important. They are not here to harm us. They are here to protect us. They eat a lot of insects. Some bat species can eat up to their body weight in insects in 30 minutes. Others can eat around 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in a single hour. It really depends on the species and the abundance of insects, but they are a high energy animal that's flying the night sky, and they have to replenish that energy, especially the lactating females. So they eat an abundance of insects. One of the things you can also do is planting native gardens. Our bats, believe it or not, are running out of food. A lot of their native food sources are no longer viable because we spray a lot of insecticide and pesticides and herbicides. If we reduce the amount of chemicals we use and we plant native plants, you will inherently attract bats and birds and amazing insects to your garden. So we heavily encourage you to be stewards of your backyard and plant native wild flowers or shrubs or even trees. They are exceptionally beautiful, and they also help with your native wildlife. And this is also a great photo. Here is some information if you are interested in planting native flowers and plants, and you can just look this up, plant native. You can type in your zip code and it shows you all the native plants in your area and what you should be planting in your backyard. And then I have this little thing up here because bats are here to protect us, help us with our night flying insects. And so I encourage you to install a bat house, plant native, and help our bats. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We do post a lot, and we will have some public releases coming up this year. So we hope to see you. Public releases are bats that have been in our care and are getting ready to go out into their natural environment. And we invite you to join us and see our rehabilitated bats go back to their natural habitat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to some of our staff members so we can show you some of.
Hi, folks. We're just switching over here, and we're going to see some bats in a few moments. If you're on a computer, you may want to put your view into speaker view so that you'll see the bats, the image of the bats or video of the bats as big as possible. You can switch over to your view type by going to the view button that's generally in the upper right-hand corner of the window with all the video and selecting speaker view there.
Can you guys see okay?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, so we're gonna bring out our first bat is Gizmo. He is a silver-haired bat. Give us 1 second. Okay, can you see Gizmo? He's very excited to eat.
Yep, we can see him.
So are there any questions for us while you are viewing our cute little silver-haired bat crunching down on his dinner?
Yeah, we do have some questions already that were popped into the chat. I believe it's Chris asked if there will be more study of bats after COVID. I guess she's referring to the fact that bats can carry coronaviruses.
Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of species, actually, one of the things that we did here at Pennsylvania Bat Rescue is we became forefront for research based in the United States as far as captive bats and how we can differentiate based on their guano if they have COVID or not, which at the time we didn't know if they did. It was really unlikely. So our bats here in Pennsylvania, oh boy, he's very anxious. Our bats here in Pennsylvania and throughout the North America cannot contract or become reservoirs for COVID-19. However, dogs and cats and other species of animal have been known to have coronaviruses. These are coronaviruses that don't harm humans. So we've been living among these for quite some time. But there is other research being done on some of the bat species in other regions of the world. And that is a great question. They did determine that a certain percentage of the DNA extracted from coronavirus is similar to a coronavirus that a bat species in Asia has. But again, it's not 100%. So it is likely that there is a secondary host. And any time that you encroach on wildlife and wildlife habitat, you can have these issues, unfortunately.
And there's another question about are bats losing territory, or I suppose are their populations declining because of moth being killed off with insecticides?
That's a great question. We actually don't know the answer to that because of all of our species not surviving white nose syndrome. So we had this one species, it's a little brown. They used to be the most common bat pre-white nose syndrome in Pennsylvania. And now only about 1% of their population remains in the entire state. So they went from the most abundant to almost extinct, locally extinct. So it's hard to differentiate how the impacts of insecticide are interfering with our bats. But one of the studies that one of our interns did was she extracted chemicals from brain tissue from deceased bats that unfortunately didn't make it. And we did find organophosphates in the brain tissue of those bats. So they are sequestering chemicals within the lipids of their brain tissue. That's a great question. Sorry for the long response.
And also, do you think that there are significant undiscovered bat species out there? Central America seems like it has a lot of bat species. Are there still species to be discovered?
I think there is. There's been 1,440 species currently identified, and that's a lot, considering just a few years ago, I think it was 1,398. So they're being discovered all the time. They're small and they're great at hiding. One of the things that bats are great at is hiding. Uh-oh, he lost his mealworm. Technical difficulties. So they're great at hiding. So it is very possible, and it's definitely possible that they're out there and we just haven't found them yet.
Yes, we did answer that question even before we read that question. Somebody asked what you were feeding them, and you just said mealworms.
Oh, yeah. So in captivity, we feed them mealworms. They don't eat them out in the wild. And we gut load them, which means we feed the mealworms a really nutritious diet. And we also put vitamins and minerals on the mealworms themselves. And I did see the question about, is Gizmo a baby bat? He's actually full grown, and Gizmo came into care after he sustained serious head trauma. So we're not sure if he flew into something or what might have happened, but he has neurological damage. So unfortunately, he can't fly, but he does enjoy getting hand fed every single night. As you can see, he's really enjoying this.
Winston asked about what research is being done on white nose fungus, and if there's a way to prevent bats from getting it, if the fungus itself can be destroyed or neutralized before it infects bats.
Oh, that's a great question. I am actually currently a full-time student at Kutztown University, and one of my undergrad research projects, I had two. One of them, I actually collected data on our captive protocol to ensure that I understood why it was working and how it was working. And the other thing that I'm doing is trying to help bats in the wild. So we are doing something a little bit different for my last remaining semester at Kutztown, and we're studying that right now. I think the Pennsylvania Game Commission has also, their biologists have also started spraying caves with an organic type of chemical. I'm not really sure what it is, but it water stresses the fungus. We're trying to find a more, somebody lost a mealworm. We're trying to find a more natural approach to the fungus, so we don't inhibit any other organisms that are essential for that cave ecosystem. All right, so I'm gonna let Gizmo finish up here. We're gonna show you another species of bat that we have, which is not known to inhabit Pennsylvania. So this little girl is Evelyn, and she is an evening bat. And these bats are found in Texas and other southern portions of the United States. But throughout the last decade, evening bats have been slowly making their way up to Pennsylvania. And so there's quite a few that have established themselves here, but they are not considered native. They look like a big brown, except half the body size. However, Evelyn is a little bit chubby. She enjoys her mealworms a little bit too much. And so she's quite pudgy. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Fairfax mentioned, I actually saw this as well on a local Facebook group. Someone had a bat in their house and they asked if anyone knows of a good pest control company that can check for more. And many people responded to capture the bat to check it for rabies. And I mean, that obviously that would involve killing the bat. So, I mean, in your view, that would isn't really necessarily recommended unless there is interaction with the bat, correct?
So the only time we have to consider euthanasia is when the bat has had known exposure to a pet or a person or child, or if they're in a room with a sleeping individual. That's always problematic because sometimes sleeping individuals don't necessarily know that they were bitten, but their teeth are sharp. I mean, they do eat insects, so they're quite sharp. And so we know when we get bit, but not necessarily somebody who could potentially sleep quite soundly. So unfortunately, if they're in your bedroom, they most likely will be euthanized to be tested for rabies. But unless it's an exposure, we don't usually euthanize. We also don't want to risk human health, so we won't take any. We'll definitely take precautions, erring on the side of caution for humans. That is our ultimate goal, to kind of bridge the gap between humans and animals and be that service for understanding these animals a little bit better. So I'm trying to get an angle here. This is, if you follow us on social media, this is Her Majesty. She already ate dinner, but I mean, how can you not love that face? So she might eat a few more. Her Majesty is a horay bat, so this is the largest bat in Pennsylvania. The Western Mastiff bat, or Western Bonneted bat, is the largest bat in the United States. So they're a little bit larger than her. And you can see she has those beautiful thumbs. They grasp on to trees, into their surroundings. It helps them climb. Her Majesty is non-releasable because she fell from her tree and fractured her fingers after a severe storm. She was either flying when she crashed or she fell out of her tree during the severe storm.
Someone asked, how fast are bats as flyers compared to birds?
That's an interesting question. A big brown bat will fly up to 60 miles an hour if it has to. So they're quite fast. I mean, big browns won't fly fast unless they need to, usually for short durations while they're chasing an insect. Horays are not very fast flyers. They're very heavy-bodied bat. She's just drinking some water right now. So they don't generally fly super fast. Gizmo, being a silver hair, his species is one of the slowest flying bats at around 30 miles an hour. Yeah, and the Mexican free-tail bats that I showed you, the Austin Congress Avenue Bridge, those are Mexican free-tail bats for the most part, and they're exceptionally fast flyers as well. They have very narrow wings, You can hear Her Majesty. She's very loud.
Evan asked, how soft are bats, and are there differences in hair texture between species?
That's a really good question. I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to see a lot of bats, but there is definitely a difference in their fur texture. Being rabies vaccinated, we are able to handle our education bats and touch them. So Her Majesty does have very floofy fur, and they groom an awful lot. Bats do not like to be dirty. They kind of remind us of cats, where they groom a lot. And so they have very floofy fur. This also keeps them warm, so they do thermoregulate, and that helps with keeping them warm. Are there any other questions?
There's a comment about rabies in bats. Julianne at another lecture heard that less than 1% of bats have rabies, and of that 1%, only 1% can spread, as the bats are so tiny that rabies kills them quickly. And to pass rabies on to humans, they have to be shedding the virus load at the time, which is a very short time period.
Yes, so that is true. The shedding time period is really dependent on the time of the year. For instance, a bat that becomes symptomatic in the winter might not show signs necessarily for quite some time, especially if it's in captivity. Whereas the summer, they do show symptoms of rabies quite quickly. But it's really challenging to tell certain symptoms because bats get a lot of different ailments. And just like people, if you have a stomach ache, it could be so many different things. And the same with bats. If they don't want to eat, or if they're grumpy, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have rabies, but it also doesn't mean that they don't. But yeah, around less than 1% test positive. And rabies is one of those diseases that is really avoidable. So if you take the precautions to handle them safely, you already avoided exposure. If you happen to have exposure, there are preventative measures such as the rabies vaccine that is 100% effective. So if you do have an exposure to even a feral cat or raccoon or a bat, please don't wait to get medical attention.
It looks like there's one more question. Judith asked if she should put up a bat box, and are there any special instructions?
Bat houses are great. Yeah, and so bat houses are designed for maternity colonies. So in the summer, I kind of rushed through the lecture because I wanted to make sure you guys had time to see the bats. So bat houses are designed for maternity colonies. So in the summer, the females will come back to their summer roosting site, and they'll form large colonies where they will have their babies together and they'll raise them together. And this is for a variety of reasons. They're social. It also helps keep them warm and protected. So bat houses are great for your maternity colonies. And there are specific instructions on placement and installation. You can find those on Bat Conservation and Management, Bat Conservation International, and Bat BNB that give really great instructions for the area that you're located in. I think Her Majesty's sleepy. Okay, any other questions?
So there's one more. How do wild bats drink?
That's a great question. So I did mention earlier that they can't really echolocate water the way that we kind of perceive it. They see it as a really flat surface. So they will skim the top of the water in flight and get a drink that way. They don't drink like birds do. They don't perch. They don't have that capability. They just skim the surface of the water. And one of the things that we found here was one of our eastern red bats was trying to get a drink. He was trying to skim the surface of the floor. We were feeding him, and he decided to fly, and he was trying to get a drink from the floor because he didn't understand that it wasn't water. He just saw it as a shiny, smooth surface. So it's really interesting. All right, I really appreciate everybody sticking around to see the bats. If you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and and enjoyed this program and our beautiful bats.
Thank you so much, Steph. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed
Oh,
meeting the bats very much.
oh, good.
And thank you for doing such great work to help these amazing creatures.
Absolutely. Thank you for everybody joining us. And I appreciate it. All right.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this program as much as I did. And we look forward to seeing you next month, third Monday of March. And if I don't see any other questions, so if I think I will just wish everyone a good night right now. And again, thank you very much, Stephanie, for joining us tonight and presenting this wonderful program. And hope to see everybody again next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.